Boys and girls, today Auntie Katie's going to read you Mr. Slow by Roger Hargreaves. Are you ready? Mr. Slow by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Slow, as you might well know, or maybe you don't, lived next door to Mr. Busy. He'd built the house himself, slowly. It had taken him 10 years. There's Mr. Slow's house. 10 years to build a house. Jeez. That's slow, isn't it? And as you might well know, or maybe you don't, Mr. Slow talked in an extraordinarily slow way. He talked like this. And every single thing he did was as slow as the way he talked. For instance, if Mr. Slow was writing this book about himself, you wouldn't be able to read it yet. He wouldn't have even got as far as this page. Wow, that's slow. For instance, if Mr. Slow was eating a currant cake for tea, it took him until bedtime. He'd eat it crumb by crumb, currant by currant, chewing each crumb and each currant 100 times. Isn't that slow? For instance, last Christmas it took Mr. Slow until New Year's Day to open his Christmas presents. And then it took him until Easter to write his thank you letters. Oh, he was a slow man. Poor Mr. Slow. Now, this story isn't about the time Mr. Slow went on a picnic with Mr. Busy. That's another story. No, this story is about the time Mr. Slow decided to get a job. He read all the job advertisements in the Sunday paper, which took him until Wednesday, and then he went to get himself a job recording the news on television. Can you imagine? It was very embarrassing. Good evening, said Mr. Slow. Here is the 9 o'clock news. It took him until midnight to read it, and everybody who was watching went to sleep. So that job wasn't any good, was it? Poor Mr. Slow. Then Mr. Slow got himself a job as a taxi driver. Take me to the railway station, cried Mr. Uppity as he leapt into his taxi. I have a train to catch at 3 o'clock. Right. Oh, said Mr. Slow, and set off 1 mile an hour, and arrived at the station at 4 o'clock. So that job wasn't any good, was it? Poor Mr. Uppity missed his train. And that summer, Mr. Slow got a job making ice cream. But by the time he made the ice cream, it wasn't exactly the right sort of weather to be selling ice cream. It's snowing, gosh. So Mr. Slow got himself a job making woolly scarves. But by the time he'd finished making the scarves, it wasn't exactly the right sort of weather to be selling scarves. Phew! Poor Mr. Slow, he's slow at everything. Poor Mr. Slow. He went around to ask the other Mr. Men what he should do. Be a racing driver, suggested Mr. Silly. What a silly suggestion. Can you imagine? No. Be an engine driver, suggested Mr. Funny. Oh, gosh. Can you imagine? No. He's too slow. Be a speed truck driver, suggested Mr. Tickle. These are all not good suggestions for Mr. Slow. Can you imagine? No. But then Mr. Happy had an extremely good idea. Most sensible. Be a steamroller driver, he suggested. And today that's exactly what Mr. Slow does. Slowly backwards and forwards, and slowly forwards he drives, up and down, down and up, ever so slowly. The next time you see a steamroller doing that, look and see if Mr. Slow is driving it. If he is, you shout to him, "Hello, Mr. Slow, are you having a nice time?" And he'll wave and shout back to you, "Yes, thank you," he'll shout. "Goodbye." Mr. Slow by Roger Hargreaves.